I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Shubham Chawla. I work with Something's Brewing. I've been one of the founding members of the company, and we're doing these sessions on a monthly basis where we're actually introducing people to different kinds of coffee and basically educating people on coffee and how you can brew at home, how you can make interesting beverages, etc. So now that summers are here, we're doing something on cold brew. We have a few fun things planned for today. For the people who are here physically to try what we're going to talk about as well, and who are not here, you can obviously I'm going to try and be as descriptive about what I'm trying to explain. And obviously, you can leave your questions in the chat or unmute yourself and speak. I think I would be able to hear you now that my phone is connected to the audio. I have Bharat with me, who is ably going to help me with making the beverages at scale because it's difficult to do both things. So that's a little bit about what the plan is. Awesome. So let's start with what is cold brew, right? Okay, so before cold brew, let's understand what is coffee, right? So coffee is basically a seed. In fact, two seeds out of one cherry. What you get is actually a green bean that 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 comes out of, if you can see, a green bean that comes out of a cherry, which is processed and then roasted. Until the roasting stage, coffee doesn't really smell or taste like anything. It's like an agricultural commodity. The roasting bit is what gives us this distinct coffee character. Now, unlike tea, which is literally just, the leaves are plucked, they are like kind of dried, the moisture levels reduced, and it's basically brewed by boiling in water. Coffee is slightly more complex. So post the roasting stage, you actually have to grind it into a certain grind size. Now we're going to specifically be talking about cold brew. So cold brew uses a distinctly coarse grind size, as you can see here. I don't know if the focus is right. Okay. Cold brew uses a distinctly coarse grind size, and this is the most important thing. If there's one thing you have to take away today, understand cold brew needs a coarse grind size. You can't take coffee ground at your local coffee roastery if you're in Bangalore, or your fancy roaster if you're in Delhi, because that may be ground for a mocha pot or South Indian filter or any other grind size. What happens is cold brew is a long form extraction, right? So usually coffee is brewed, say, within 30 seconds if it's an espresso machine, about 3-4 minutes if it's a pour over. Cold brews are between 12 and 24 hours. So what happens here? It's a longer extraction. Now, when an extraction is longer, you want to slow down the interaction between the water and the coffee. How you do that is you grind coarse. So it's super simple. If you take anything, that is, say, take one bean, you put it in water, you leave it for 24 hours, nothing much will happen because there's only so much surface area, right? The moment you break this into 4 parts, there's more of surface area. So the finer you break something down, or the finer you grind coffee, you have finer particles, which means more surface area for water and coffee to interact with, right? Higher the surface area, higher the extraction. Now, why do we get into these technical details, right? Coffee is very complex. It's not like tea or any other kind of beverage. A slight variation here or there can make or break your beverage. So you basically want to ensure that your surface area is accurate for your brewing mechanism. Otherwise, you'd either have a very bitter or very under-extracted sour light cup of coffee, which we'll get into. We have a slightly under-extracted cup of cold brew for you guys to try as well. We have perfectly brewed cold brew as well, so we'll get into that. But what I'm trying to start with is, what is cold brew? Cold brew is basically a slow form of extraction between water and coffee. Like, because it's slow, you need a higher grind size, a coarser grind size. What else is really important, right? By basically what the name suggests, cold brew. What is cold brew? Cold brew is basically something that is brewed with room temperature or cold water. It's not brewed with hot water. Why is that? It's super simple, right? In any science experiment, when you take the temperature higher, it catalyzes, it acts as a catalyst, and it increases the reaction time. It reacts more. So a higher temperature basically leads to more extraction, right? So even when you brew tea at home, if you brew tea at a lower temperature, it's going to be less. It's going to have less strength. It's going to take longer to extract. So here, when we are doing a 12 to 24 hour long extraction basis our recipe, we are going to do it at room temperature or cold water in the fridge. The third thing, again, how do you do cold brew? You have different ratios, right? A ratio is basically how much coffee you use to how much water. So A cold brew is usually a 1:10 to a 1:12 ratio. What you get ultimately is something that is decently strong. So if you were to, again, this is a fun fact. If you were to actually measure caffeine levels, if you take a well extracted cold brew versus an espresso versus a brewed cup of coffee, your cold brew is ideally per ml going to have more milligrams of caffeine. So an espresso usually would have half the amount of caffeine than a brewed coffee, and a cold brew would have at least as much as a brewed coffee, if not more. Again, why is that? We're getting everything out with time into the water. And the reason why we kind of try and extract it to an optimal or almost an over optimal level is because we're going to dilute it with ice, right? So you're going to add ice, you're going to add, say, flavors or whatever. So a cold brew per ml is going to have more caffeine. But anyway, so use a coarse grind size, do a 1:10 or 1:12 ratio, which is a stronger ratio or a higher ratio than what you would do with, say, a pour over, right? A pour over would basically be a 1:15. A French press would be 1:12, 1:14. When I say 1 is to something, I mean 1 part by weight of coffee versus 12 parts of water, right? So if I'm taking 10 grams of coffee, it's 120 ml of water. Anyway, so that's something to do with the grind size, the temperature we brew at, and also the ratios. Another couple of points, right? Before we get into even like how to brew cold brew, these are just like base parameters that one person should understand before they get into it. There's something called roast level, right? Roasting is a combination of an art and a science. It's fairly technical and a lot of fun. What roasting does is it basically takes out certain flavors out of the bean that otherwise wouldn't come out by various reactions during the roasting process, like the Maillard reaction, caramelization, etc. Ultimately, the crux of the matter is that a lighter roast coffee is going to be slightly more acidic, won't have as much of a chocolatey, earthy note, and a darker roast coffee is basically going to have uh, a lot more acidity, sorry, a lot more strength, a lot more body, a lot more mouthfeel, and obviously have a chocolatey, nutty note. And a medium roast is kind of going to be somewhere in the middle, right? It's going to have some amount of acidity and some amount of heavy body, chocolatey, earthy notes. Now, important to understand with a cold brew, you are extracting over a long period of time, right? So ultimately, when you have something at room temperature, that is any food item, and this goes beyond cold brew, you're going to ultimately have a problem if there is some amount of rancidity that creeps up, right? Which happens more when there's there's little of an oily note in what we're trying to do. Now, a darker roast coffee predominantly is going to have oils coming out on the surface. That means, Bharat, do we have any of the dark roasts? Maybe I think the Maverick, Tall, Dark, Handsome, or that's perfect. So a dark roast is basically going to have oils on the surface. Now, this still doesn't have as many oils, but basically, if you go to a Starbucks or just look into the hopper at a Starbucks or a CCD, you're going to have oils on the surface. Now, when you do a cold brew with a dark roast, be a little careful because it can become rancid really fast. Thanks, Praj. It can become rancid really fast. So I always say use a medium plus, medium light. Don't use a very light roast. We, in fact, this under extracted cold brew we have here for you guys to try is basically a light roast brewed over 18 hours, which is actually an ideal time. Let's not give the first coffee to them. That is not nice. Let's let's start with a regular coffee and then we can a good extracted cold brew. So maybe the bean brew. Yeah, go ahead. So basically, the lighter roast would need a longer time to extract. So if you're doing a lighter roast, do make it a 20 or 24-hour extraction. If you're doing a darker roast, how do you deal with the rancidity or the oiliness that can come out? Reduce your brewing time. Make it 12 hours, right? Make it even 11 hours. Experiment with maybe a slightly higher temperature. Do like a 40-degree or a 50-degree initial bloom, which is putting the water into the cold brewer. So these are some of the technical aspects of it, right? Before we get into the more fun parts of different kinds of brewers and how we brew and how it tastes and maybe some recipes, do we have any questions regarding the more technical aspects of making a cold brew? Okay, great question. Let's rewind a little more. What we've been discussing right now is roast and ground coffee powder. Roast and ground coffee powder is basically when you take beans that come from the farm, you roast it, and you grind it. Now, when you grind this won't dissolve in water. This is not instant. This is not instant coffee powder. This is ground coffee beans, right? Now, ground coffee beans don't dissolve in water. You have to extract whatever you want out of the coffee and throw the grounds. Instant coffee is basically, or any kind of coffee that dissolves, soluble coffee or any soluble thing. This goes with regard to anything. It could be soluble milk powder, soluble tea powder. Exactly. The concept is that once the coffee is ground and it's ground super fine, you have these large factories, and one of the largest factories in the world is actually based out of India. One of the largest companies that does this white labeling. What they do is they extract the coffee liquid, and then it goes into these large towers where you dehydrate the entire solution we had, and what you get at the end is fine coffee powder. There are different technologies. I mean, this concept of instant coffee was actually popularized during the First World War and the Second World War, when soldiers in the West had to be sent some form of um, uh, energy booster to sustain wars. And it also became popular when there was a depression and when economies haven't done well, because instant coffee predominantly is cheaper than freshly ground coffee, because you can get a lot more out of the same buck because you're over extracting, right? So in fact, it's still very popular in obviously some parts of India, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe. So if you look at wherever economies still haven't risen as much, you have more of an instant coffee market. And as a per capita income rises, people start appreciating the finer things in life and can afford it, and then move to roasting ground coffee, which is basically how countries have evolved. And this is religion agnostic. This is economy. This is purely dependent on economics. It's not dependent on any other external factor, right? This is what we've noticed. But okay, coming back to this. So any instant coffee is meant to be slightly superior. Slightly inferior. It is basically the rejected coffee beans that haven't been into the specialty or the commercial grade, and it's basically, the C's or coffees with defects that basically are bought in bulk by these players, roasted, ground, extracted, and exported all over the world, right? So I don't have a view that is very, very positive on instant coffee in general, but I think it's great to get the people into coffee so that they can start at least understanding what coffee is, right? Because otherwise it can become a little intimidating, because it's not as easy to brew as maybe just taking a spoon and mixing it in. But yeah, so that's my thought on instant coffee. Do we have any other questions, or should we just move to the brewing part of cold brew? Absolutely. Instant coffee is pre-brewed coffee, and it is dehydrated, and it's basically what would be used in like a space mission in the 60s or 70s for like food or beverage, right? So it's basically soluble powder. Instant coffee also has multiple. In fact, I do this session called Demystifying Coffee, where I go into depths of each kinds of coffee. But without going into the depths, there are still different technologies used in instant coffees. There is spray drying and freeze drying. In fact, these are two very distinct technologies used across food products. Just know this, that freeze drying is a superior alternative to spray drying, which uses also vacuum and lower temperatures, which keeps aromas and quality intact. Whereas spray drying is actually just heat. So you lose out on all the delicate aromatics that coffee has. Also, fun fact, I don't know how fun it is, but coffee is more complex than wine and a few other, most other food and beverage items. Coffee has over 1,000 different chemical compounds and aromatics, which actually impact flavor and flavor notes. Wine is still at about 1/3 or 1/4 of that, right? But it's a lot easier to understand wine in a more technical perspective, which is why we haven't reached coffee appreciation hasn't reached the epitome that it can. Coffee is still not made in the lab. I mean, you still need coffee beans to extract flavor of coffee, unlike vanilla, which can be synthetic, unlike chocolate, which can be synthetic. So it's still something we don't understand very well, right? And in Demystifying Coffee, we cover a lot more about all those aspects. But yes, that is exactly what instant coffee is. Great, convenient way to have coffee, but not the best. Also, instant coffee has slightly lesser amount of caffeine than, say, a brewed cup of coffee. It also has a lot of adulterants. I can go on and on about instant coffee. Let's not get into instant coffee now. But moving back to cold brew. Okay. So what we've done, right? Uh, let's go for it. Okay, absolutely. Good question. So if you were to draw, okay, cool. Does room temperature cold brewing have any difference in comparison with cold water? What? Okay, the question was, does it make a difference when you're brewing with cold water versus room temperature water? Absolutely. Initially, it will, because okay, so it does make a difference when you're brewing with cold water or room temperature in the initial phase. So try to understand your extraction. Okay, if you're extracting coffee in a 3 minute or 4 minute window, your temperature of water has an extreme importance in your beverage quality, right? Now, what is happening here is that you're brewing over 12 or 18 hours, right? Now, if you use slightly colder water and you bring it back to room temperature versus if you use room temperature water and you put it in the fridge, it would make a difference where the bulk of the extraction happens. So if your bulk 10 to 12 hours is happening, it's going to be a much slower extraction, push it to 24 hours. If your bulk of the extraction is happening at room temperature, then you can reduce the time. But the point is that the initial bit will only have a difference if you do a hot bloom. A hot bloom is a very interesting concept in cold brewing. Okay, so remember we discussed what different roast profiles give you in terms of flavor, right? That also happens in terms of temperature of brewing. And sorry, this also happens in terms of temperature of brewing and roast level. So when you do a hot water extraction, you are getting a lot more acidity. But when you do a pure play cold brew, you are getting just the base body, chocolatey, nutty, like a rounded cold brewed coffee experience. You're not getting like the complex notes in your mouth. But do you want to make something interesting while I'm talking? Awesome. So my point is that when you do a hot bloom, that is in the first couple of minutes of your cold brew extraction, right? You use hot water at 93, 94 degrees Celsius, and then you dim that down with room temperature or cold water. Your final beverage will be slightly more different. It will have more acidity and more complexity. But to start with, whether you use cold or room temperature won't make that much. Shivangi, I think, are you on mute? There was some. Okay, cool. Sorry, guys. So if you use cold water or room temperature, in the beginning it wouldn't make as much of a difference as it would during the bulk of your brewing time. So this goes for any experiment in life, right? If there are 10 parameters you can vary, in this case, there's grind size, there's ratio, there's temperature of water, there is a brewing duration, there is roast level of coffee, there are a bunch of things, right? In fact, even ambient temperature is one. If you're in Delhi right now, it's very different from if you're in Delhi in December. That makes a huge difference. My point is, play around with one parameter. So if you're super interested with playing around with the temperature of water, keep everything else equal, keep the grind size equal, and then see how your final beverage tastes. The good thing about cold brewing is that if your coffee is under extracted, like in this one, which we will make you drink, you don't have to give up and feel sad about it. All you have to do is try a little bit, and if it's under extracted, leave the grounds back in, right? And pop it back in your fridge or your counter or wherever you are brewing. And if it is over extracted, you can do what Bharat is doing: add some ice, dilute it with water, etc. Cold brew is the most forgiving method of brewing coffee, besides instant coffee, but it is a much higher reward than instant coffee, right? It has a lot more flavor and complexity. So my point is, if you haven't brewed coffee before, start with cold brew, and it's super convenient. Do we have any more questions? I don't want to miss out on the brewing bit.
Can a cold brew be heated up post extraction? Do we really need to bloom a cold brew? Wouldn't the degassing happen anyway?
I think the second question is answered. It's okay.
Okay, the second question answered. Thank you. The first question was, can cold brew be reheated? I'll give you a very interesting story. When I was in college in Bombay, obviously rents were expensive, and my flatmates used to be partying when I had to do my assignments to sit at a Starbucks. Now, I used to buy one beverage and sit for a few hours and sit for 5 hours, 6 hours, do my assignments and get done with it. Once I forgot about my coffee. One day I forgot about my coffee. I requested the barista to just heat it. I didn't know much about coffee at that point in life. I just knew I enjoyed coffee, right? It was a good kick. So I requested her to heat it up. She gave me this very dirty look and she threw it and she made me a new one. That's when I learned that Starbucks has this policy, and which is and later I got to know why they have this policy. They don't reheat beverages, they make you a new beverage. Do not abuse this hack. At least this was the case, back in 2014 and like 6-8 years ago. But the point is that coffee in general should not be reheated. Coffee is very delicate in general if you're brewing fresh. Why is instant coffee not superior or cannot taste good in general? It's because of this funda, right? Coffee has been extracted, cooled down, and now reheated. So you can reheat cold brew. Don't expect a superior beverage. You will have the caffeine. You can maybe add some flavors, but my suggestion is don't reheat cold brew. If you want to do a hot extraction, try maybe a brew on a mocha pot, or you're basically going to burn the coffee if you reheat cold brew, or if you reheat any coffee for that matter. Yeah.
I got it. My question actually came from the place that I have a cold right now and I can't drink cold brew. So that's all.
Damn. You have friends. you can barter. But don't. I mean, but you can try reheating. Try it, and then you'll know if you like it or you don't. But yeah.
No,
awesome.
I'm sure I would. Now that I know, of course, I could keep it at room temperature instead, right? I mean, let it.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can bring it down to
regular temperature.
Room temperature.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay. Yeah, tell me.
Hi, I'm Avni here, and I have a question. So, can we play around with the concentration? Say, have a more thicker sort of concentrate, and then try heating it, because it will eventually, the body of the coffee will then eventually even out at the end of the heating. Say, for example, the question that she asked, like, can a cold brew be heated? So if you do it at a regular room temperature coffee, and the concentrate, I mean, the extract that you get is very thin. So if you heat it, it might taste bitter. So, so I'm just thinking the reverse way. I mean, like you brew it a little thicker and then you heat it. So, and then even if it flattens out, it'll still taste good.
So interesting question, Avni. I would have to try. Frankly speaking, I haven't tried this. The comparison between, say, brewing a concentrate versus a diluted. Basically, the point Avni is making is that can I brew a concentrate and then reheat it rather than basically have a diluted beverage and reheat it? I'm not sure about this. In principle, what you're saying may work out if there wasn't a general degradation of coffee on a second heat. So it is a accepted fact that when you reheat coffee, you're losing out on some of the flavor compounds and you're losing out on a lot of the delicate compounds, right? So whether you use a concentrate or a diluted beverage, you're going to have a suboptimal outcome and a suboptimal solution. What is a better suboptimal solution? I'm not sure of. We'll have to try that. But it does make a little bit of sense that if you had to reheat something, you'd rather reheat a concentrate and then have a lower temperature diluter after that, which could be, say, a water at 90 degrees or milk at 80 degrees.
Correct.
So, fair, interesting. I think that would be a better solution, but still not a great solution.
Okay. Thanks, Shubham.
Welcome. Yeah.
There is one more question.
Yeah.
Can we use the cold brew method in French press mix?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I'll come to that in a second. Do we have a question here as well? Okay. Awesome. Okay. So this I'll come to in a bit because it's a very straightforward answer and also not. Okay. So beans. Should we use Robusta, Arabica, and cold brew, right? So cold brew in general is a method that brings out more body and more chocolatey notes and more caffeine into the beverage. Robusta in general as a varietal has more of all these things. A blend of an Arabica Robusta from personal experience works great in a cold brew. 100% Robusta cold brew could be overkill, but it could work really well in, like, say, alcoholic drinks or something that needs very little, or like, for example, if you're making a tiramisu at home, right? But purely as a beverage, I haven't actually tried 100% Robusta, but it works well in terms of like cooking with coffee, or because it has more flavor, it has more body, it doesn't get lost. If you're making a martini or something, you can use 100% Robusta. It also has a lot of bitterness, right? So when you're actually making something sweet, you need something bitter to balance. So you can do that for cooking or making alcoholic beverages that are slightly sweetened as well. Usually you can also create like a ratio of 80-20 or 60-40, or the higher being Arabica, the lower being Robusta. But again, this is all purely on experimentation. If you ask me, 100% Arabica, slightly medium class roast works really well for a cold brew. You don't need Robusta. You don't need Robusta. Regarding the other questions, the other question was, can we use a French press to brew cold brew? Okay, so this is a French press. I have done it. I'll be honest. I have used a French press to brew cold brew. There are two things to understand when you're cold brewing, right? One is that the longevity of your cold brew will depend on how well your cold brew is filtered, right? Now, what is your filtration? Filtration is basically, we discussed, we used this to brew cold brew, and this has to be filtered out and thrown out. Now, there are predominantly two kinds of filtration used in cold brew. One is a mesh filtration, which could be either a plastic or a metal mesh, which is super fine if you can. I'm going to bring this closer. Bharat, can you also get the Toddy paper filters out? So this is a mesh form of cold brew filtration. Now, this mesh is super fine, guys, but it's still not as fine as paper. Always remember, paper as a filter will take out more than any other kind of plastic or metal mesh, purely by virtue of it having smaller holes, right? And this is a Toddy, commercial Toddy filter paper, which is basically like obviously food grade, and this filters out more. Now, why I'm getting into this is that, Bharat, thank you. Why I'm getting into this is that the finer your filter, the higher quality your cold brew in terms of a life of your cold brew and how it will taste, right? It'll taste good even after 2-3 days if stored in the fridge. The larger point I'm trying to make is that when you use a French press, your mesh is even coarser. It's a metal mesh. Do you remember the Hario Mizudashi I showed you? And this is a metal mesh, even though it's double layered. It is not as fine. So it's barely going to last a day. You can't actually filter out everything out of the metal mesh. The other thing is that, thanks. There's another way of brewing cold brew. Thanks, Bharat. Almost slipped my mind. It's one of the better, more healthier ways of brewing cold brew in terms of the environment. It's an organic cotton cloth-based filter. You have some cleaning that needs to be done, which we'll get into this. But thank you. The point I'm trying to make here is that a French press will not give you as clean a cup at the end, and paper also filters out some of the oils, right? Which also increases the life of your cold brew and makes it more balanced. Coming back to the French press, the other thing with cold brewing is that it's a long form extraction. Now, a long form extraction, ideally when your coffee, which is acidic, in contact with metal. Now, this is I think a report by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US. I think that's the full form. They basically said that it's not FDA approved to brew French press cold brew, because there are some reactions that happen at room temperature over long periods of time, right? Imagine you brew it, you store it, and you put it in the fridge. It's not super healthy. I've done it. Don't do it on a regular basis. You can try it out. If you're brewing a cold brew on the French press, try to keep it sub 10 hours, sub 12 hours. Don't do a 24-hour extraction. Do it in the fridge. And ideally, if you're brewing in the French press, don't leave this inside. Don't leave the mesh inside, because you're creating more problems. Just brew it in the glass chamber. And when you have to filter it out, bring this out. I mean, that's just like one hack to avoid whatever the FDA says will be bad for you. But it's not the best way to brew cold brew, but, because of these two reasons. Still works though. Nothing against brewing with a French press besides the potential health implications. Okay, cool. I get lost in questions. I enjoy answering questions. Sorry about that. Okay, we'll take the questions later. So let's move back to brewing. So first, let's cover how to brew cold brew at home, right? The simplest, least intensive method is the cold brew. Thank you. Is this cold brew maker? It's a Japanese brand called Hario. What you basically do is you take your coarsely ground coffee into this chamber. You put your coffee in. You take your jug. Don't break it. I know enough people who've broken their jug and then they say, "Ab chhanne ka kya karu?" But you basically put the grounds in this. You pour water from your water source through the coffee grounds. Fill it up. Figure out your ratio. It's super simple. Maybe if you don't have a scale, you can actually do a one-time calibration of how much coffee fits till what level and how much water fits post the coffees, and then you don't never have to measure again. If you're in Indranagar, drop by. We have a scale here as well. We can help you picking your beans, etc. So once that is done, you put the lid on, and you can do a slow form cold brew in your fridge. You can keep it in the door of your fridge for 18 and 24 hours. If you're keeping it outside, sub 18 hours is what I would recommend. And that's it, right? Once the 18-hour extraction is done, take the lid off, put the lid back in. The grounds can either go, not all plants like coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are acidic. I have killed some plants by putting it in some plants that aren't, that it's not good for. So if you have a compost bin, do that. If you have coconut oil, you can actually dry out the grounds, make a scrub. You can do a bunch of things with the grounds, but you can actually throw it. There's nothing wrong with it because ultimately it's not going to go and cause an issue in the landfill, right? It's ultimately going to contribute to some of the good waste we can create, but relatively. But anyway, so once that's done, you can consume this. If it's brewed in the fridge, you can keep it up to 4-5 days. I know people have kept it for 7 days. Ideally, sub 7 days is what I would recommend, but consume it within like 4 days for an optimal beverage quality. The other method is something that is a toddy, which is basically, so this is the toddy artisan. This is a toddy home brewer. The principle is the same. That's okay. The principle is the same. This does a mesh extraction. These do a paper extraction. So this comes with small paper filters like this, and this comes with slightly larger paper filters. So this is like for say 1 person or 2 people, and this can do up to 1.8 liters, right? It's measured in gallons because it's American, so it's very confusing. But in translation, it's about 1.8 liters. The broader point here is that these cold brews are going to be slightly more superior in beverage quality because they use paper filtration. They also will last slightly longer, again, because of paper filtration, right? And if you're going to have it black as is, just with ice, these might be more enjoyable. This would be maybe slightly more enjoyable than these if you're going to add any flavors or any milk, because it ultimately has more body, because ultimately the oils of coffee contribute to body and paper filters out the oils, right? Thumb rule. The third way, which is a great way, so this is the Coffeesock. There's another Indian brand called Wobh. When we started something brewing, Wobh didn't exist. So I found this brand on the internet. This is an American brand which uses organic cotton, but Wobh in India very much is making these now in India. You can check them out on our website as well, or you can DM us on Instagram and Vivek will help you out. So this is an organic, it's called literally called a Coffeesock. It's like a sock. You put your ground coffee in this, and you basically have any jar like this or a Borosil jar at home. Basically use a glass container, don't use plastic. Again, plastic is non-reactive, but again, coffee is slightly acidic and you don't want to, just avoid using ordinary plastic at least. We're just using these to store right now because we're out of containers. Yeah. So awesome. So you basically put grounds in this and you can do a 12 to 24 hour extraction. Remember, we don't have coffee brewed with a Coffeesock right now, no? Okay, maybe next time we'll figure, because it tastes very different. Coffee on a cotton filter is like a hybrid of a mesh and a paper. So paper will filter out the oils and hence be very it won't have as much of a mouthfeel. Mesh will have too much of a mouthfeel. It won't have a very clean finish. Cotton filters, surprisingly, if cleaned and stored well, you have to clean these. Put them in boiling water for like a while, and don't use like Vim and stuff. You can use baking soda or something like that. Or we have something called what espresso machines what is used to clean espresso machines. We have a powder called the Ernex powder. It's a German brand. That works well. It's food grade. The point is that they create a very balanced cup that gives you the best of both worlds, but more maintenance. So better cup, but a lot more work. So check out Wobh, check out Coffeesock. Thank you. So these are 3 main ways to make cold brew. Ratios, again, personal preference. 1:10 is a good thumb rule to start. A lot of brands that do cold brew at scale would always use a higher coffee to water ratio, because the more concentrated beverage, I think Avni had one point there which I would like to add. The more concentrated your cold brew, the longer the life in general would be, and hence, they do a more concentrated extraction and dilute it further into parts. So this is predominantly how we brew cold brew. The toddy is, I can show you guys how to do the toddy, but it's a little tricky to show on video like this. There are some nice videos on how to use the toddy. The Mizudashi is super simple. I think we've covered Toddy and Mizudashi and the Coffeesock. Do we have any questions related to brewing? No. So ultimately, okay. So solubility of water is like a whole different science. My bad. The question was, do the flavors have to be added when you start brewing the cold brew, or is it something you add later on? So again, let's just look at like water, right? Like water, not everything is soluble in water. Not everything is soluble at the same rate in water. So when you actually take a cold brew or any kind of coffee, it's still 98% water. After, no matter how much you, jitna bhi aap sar phod lo, how much ever effort you do, you're only getting 2% coffee, because 98% of it is still water, like composition wise. And when you look at dissolving any other thing in water, it's going to have a different solubility rate. So for example, chicory, which is a famous adulterant in coffee, has a much higher solubility rate in coffee. So you may take 1 part coffee, 1 part chicory, put it in water, your final beverage will be 70-80% chicory, only 20% coffee, because chicory just dissolves faster than coffee. And any liquid, especially water, has a maximum amount of basically the threshold after which it doesn't, more things don't dissolve in it. So then what do? You increase temperature. Like when you make sugar syrup at home, right? You use heat, it's a catalyst. You use pressure, it's a catalyst. So my idea over here is that brew coffee for what coffee is, and then add whatever flavors you want. You can experiment with adding flavors on an early stage, but do know that your first 20 tries will be shit, and be okay with that. I stayed in Delhi for around 2 winters, and I in this winter used to age Old Monk with different spices. So what I learned was clove actually dissolves really fast, and cinnamon is a more slower form, right? So day 0 add so many centimeter square of cinnamon, then day so much add elaichi, then day so much you add long. So it's obviously going to be way better than adding any flavor at the end of it, but it has more effort. Anything in life that you put in more effort will ultimately yield better results. So yeah, so you can do what Shivangi asked me. You can add flavors on hour 0 of your cold brew, but do know it's going to take a lot more tries for you to succeed with a good beverage. Awesome, thanks. Any brewing related questions? Because I don't want to digress as I always do.
How about steeping and then filtering with the cloth?
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that you can steep and filter with the cloth, but ultimately it won't be as you expect. Like, for example, if you're making chai, you'll add 1 teaspoon of tea leaves and 2 elaichis, and you know what to get. In a cold brew, what happens is, because it's a long form extraction, elaichi ultimately maybe will dissolve, and not maybe, will dissolve more than tea leaves at room temperature. So your final beverage will be a weak tea with more elaichi. So you need to play around with you can reach out to me. I can maybe give you some tips on if you want to experiment with this. But ultimately, it's going to be a good experiment that will take weeks. Awesome. Bharat is okay. So we'll get into flavors in a bit. I'll just give you some thumb rules for flavoring cold brews. Do we have any other questions? Cool. Yeah. Okay. So how do we flavor cold brews, right? We are going to be strictly discussing non-alcoholic for trials today, non-alcoholic flavorings. So basically any citric-based flavor pairs well with cold brew. That's your thumb rule, right? So whether you want to be fancy and get grapefruit, or whether you want to do a nice orange or lime flavored cold brew, go crazy, it will more often than not taste well. They work well as flavors and garnishes as well. Garnishes wise also mint and some other stuff. So Bharat made me an orange flavored cold brew, which I think you guys tried. I think he's making a pomegranate flavored cold brew now. When I say flavored, right now he's just using canned juices. So Bharat, what is the ratio you're using? 1:1. And ice above that. And you're shaking it. So basically, then you okay, cool.
I added a mint leaves and vegetable.
Awesome. Okay. So what Bharat did was the cold brews are between 1:10 and 1:12. Again, these are medium plus roast, so they're not super light roast because we need slightly darker roasted cold brews to hold flavors, right? Otherwise, it just becomes watered down. Bharat is using a 1:1 ratio of 1 part juice, that is the previous one was orange juice, now it's pomegranate juice, and 1 part cold brew shaken with ice. When you shake something, it dilutes for about 30 seconds and you just toss the ice out. You can further add ice to it. We also, so we have a great partner in Swa Syrups, which is a Bangalore-based startup. Vaishali does a very nice, all-natural, chemical-free syrups. So there are lots of brands that you will see in a lot of coffee shops that basically are chemically flavored. So this is all natural. So these flavors kind of go well with cold brew. So we use these in the experience center here. If you ever walk by, so these basically taste well with coffee. These are sweetened; they have sugar in them, so you won't need to add sugar. Again, the ratio for these depends. So it could be 20 grams of this with ice and 150 ml of cold brew, but you can play around here and there. The point I'm trying to make is use citric flavors with your cold brew. It's going to come out really well. You don't want to use something that would make it, say, medicinal. Like before the session, Bharat made me have a cranberry cold brew, which I'm not going to serve to you guys because it's very medicinal. So basically, you want to use flavors that will complement your cold brew. Cold brew also goes really well with some alcohols like gin and rum. Maybe not as much with whiskey, but they go well with that. You can further cut it out with some sugar syrup and etc. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can do with that. You can also make Baileys at home. Thanks for that. You can also make your own Baileys at home with cold brew, concentrated cold brew, condensed milk, whipped cream, etc. Like it's super delicious, and it's all natural. So these are some things you can do with cold brew. Cooking with cold brew is also a lot of fun. You can make your own coffee syrups with, like, say, a sweetened base with jaggery or something, and put it over your pancakes or dosa, whatever you want. And so that's basically just my overview on flavored beverages with cold brew. Can we take questions now? Or is there any specific topic which you guys would like me to cover, which I haven't covered pertaining to cold brewed coffee? No?
Question: what happens when you cross the 24 hours?
Nothing really. Basically, what happens is if you try your coffee at the 18-hour mark and it's still under extracted, maybe now we can serve under extracted coffee to our guests. If it crosses the 18-hour mark, it's still under extracted. You keep checking every hour. You keep sipping a little bit. 24 hours is just like a thumb rule where it's most probably going to be over extracted by 24 hours, no matter how light roasted your coffee is, provided your ratio is not 1:100 or some weird ratio like that. So just be wary post 24 hours. It's like there's no point of no return as such, but it's just not going to taste amazing. Nothing happens post. So again, extraction, right? So extraction is high earlier on, and as time progresses, because water can only hold so much, the extraction slows down, right? You hit a threshold. So it's not like the extraction rate is going to be the same. So R4 to 5, the extraction is a lot higher than R24 to 25. But ultimately, the quality of extraction is basically going down the drain, right? It's just getting bitterer and bitterer. So you don't want that. What else? Okay, what's the taste difference between over extracted and the under extracted? Great question. Did you try this coffee? Okay, so what did it taste like? So this is the under extracted coffee. It's not super under extracted, guys. It's also 18 hours, but it's a lighter roast. My point is, because it's a lighter roast, you need a longer extraction time of maybe 24 hours. What does it taste like to you? Does it taste different than the first cold brew you had? Okay, yeah, give them the play. So is it slightly more sour? Is it light bodied, right? It's just washing off your palate. This is what a optimally brewed cold brew would taste like, and what you tasted before was the slightly under extracted. Sorry, that was a raw taste. This one, no. What you had right now is a medium dark roast for 18 hours, and what you had before was a light roast for 18 hours. So the point is that the light roast takes a longer time to extract, and this could still be more extracted and have a more optimal taste and less sour and more body and more chocolatey. So a lighter, an under extracted cold brew will basically have a lighter body, as you said, be more sour, almost be like could also be slightly uh, acidic to hoga. It basically won't have any of the chocolatey earthy notes you would expect in a usual cold brew. And the darker over extracted cold brew will basically be extremely bitter, and obviously you would have muted acidity, but it would be very bitter. Like it just bitterness that shines out. There's nothing else that and the oil, like you would actually see the oil on your coffee, and you can also see when you make out, like it'll be like as black as death. But yeah, so that would be basically the difference between a under and an over extracted cold brew. Thanks. The point that I'm trying to make here is that you basically need to understand that when you put 100 grams of ground coffee in water, the coffee is going to absorb at least 100 grams / ml of water by weight, because that's what coffee does. It absorbs, right? And like anything that you dissolve with water, it'll absorb some amount. So if you put let's say a slice of lime in water, it's ultimately going to bloat up. So it's going to absorb some of the water. The same way, your concentration, sorry, I have to keep this somewhere. Your concentration, I can't put it back in that. Huh? your concentration cannot be a 1:1, 1:2, 1:3. Imagine doing 1:3. You take 1 part coffee, 3 parts water, 1 part is diluted anyway, right? Now, what you ultimately are doing is that if you do a 1:5, you're going to lose 1 part of water. So you get 4 parts of concentrate coffee. So that's a good ratio to start with. So 1:5, 1:6 is a good concentrate cold brew ratio to start with. You can push up to 1:7, 1:8. But 1:5 is like my thumb rule if I have to make concentrate. Below that, you're basically suboptimal. You're losing out. You're wasting more coffee than extracting. Awesome. I hope I answered that question. Thanks for it.
One last question. Can a cold brew be brewed in milk or any other medium other than water?
Yeah, no, actually interesting. You should try that. Basically, milk just won't extract the coffee into itself. What you can do is you can brew a cold brew concentrate and add milk to your final beverage. Try extracting cold brew with milk, and don't call me and abuse me after that. So, yeah, basically exactly. So if you do it, Bharat has a very valid point. I've never done that at room temperature. So at room temperature, milk will spoil anyways. You do it in the fridge. So anyway, not going to get anything out of it because it won't extract. But yeah, don't do that at room temperature. You're going to basically get paneer at the end of it. Yeah, good point. Yeah, exactly. A great beverage, actually, 2 great beverages are, one is what Bharat said. Take a concentrate cold brew, throw some ice, add Milkmaid, right? Milkmaid is basically your mithai maid, what Amul calls and Nestle calls Milkmaid. It's basically condensed milk. Super delicious, crazy. Have it at night. You'll have a high between coffee and sugar. You won't be able to sleep. It's a lot of fun. Another great beverage is actually it originated in Portugal. It's called the Mazagran. So the Mazagran is actually a really refreshing summer beverage, and summers are coming in. You take cold brew, you squeeze a lot of lime, and you take sugar syrup. Garnish it maybe a mint leaf. It's amazing. It's basically a coffee lemonade. It's a really nice beverage. Make sure your cold brew is a concentrate in this case. Otherwise, it'll just be too diluted. You wouldn't enjoy it, because what happens is lime with mild coffee is going to be crap. Lime with concentrated coffee and a lot of ice will be good. So it's called a Mazagran. You can Google it. I think last summer I had done a recipe for this. It must be on somewhere on our website, I think. Awesome. I actually like my tonics with espresso over cold brew. espresso with tonic kind of really enhances the tonic enhances the crema of the espresso. But again, if you're doing a coffee tonic and cold brew, again, consider cold brews all the way. But that's a good idea. Cinnamon gets extracted in tonic, and then you can add it to the coffee. That's interesting. I did not know that. Awesome. Any other suggestions, tips? Clearly a lot of you like do a lot of this. Maybe obviously we'll send out like the next session. Maybe we'll do it in more depth. And yeah, awesome. Do we? Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a good idea. So okay, so we can also do 2 more formats. One is obviously if you're in Bangalore, you can come down and book a session with us. We can do a cold brew brewing session with our team and you. The other thing we can do is actually we did this with the French press workshop where we actually shipped out these kits to people, and then we did a live. Obviously it wasn't free. It was a much closed. It was a more closed group. It was about 10 people, and it was a more interactive discussing flavor. So right now, when I'm saying this tastes like this, you're listening to me. It could be crap, and I'm saying it tastes like chocolate, right? But in that case, you can actually try and tell me, hey, that's not chocolate, it's crap. So if you're interested in that, write into us, send us a DM on Instagram, or just email us, and would love to. So we're trying to figure out also different kinds of formats, right? We do like 1 day, 2 day trainings over here with Shivangi, who's been asking all the questions. She takes in-depth training sessions. This is a lighter workshop where we're discussing coffee. So we're doing a lot of different things. We're recording videos which are uploading on YouTube. But yeah, I mean, your feedback and input would be super helpful. And if you want to be a part of this side, and if you want to play a part on this side where you want to do some videos, you want to take part in creating content for us, that is also like something that it's difficult to stand in front of the camera and do this. So if you want to do that, I mean, reach out to us and we could make that happen as well. If you know what you're talking about. But awesome. Thank you. Okay, awesome guys. Have a great Wednesday. Catch up. Bye. Thank you.